It's impossible to separate oil from the history and culture of the Gulf Coast. Fossil fuel extraction along the Gulf and in its waters has, over the last century, become inextricably linked to how we understand the region's economy and identity. But this didn't happen overnight, and the road to the ingrained notion of the Gulf Coast and oil and gas, it's long and winding. And as our energy system is changing, so too are how oil and gas companies are imagining their futures. These realities have deep impacts for those of us living on the Gulf, as well as the environment and animals all throughout the region. Today, we're starting a new series focused on the history and future of the oil and gas industry across the region, and we'll explore both how the Gulf came to be so enmeshed with oil and gas and some of the lasting, often accidental, implications of this legacy for the region. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Before we jump into our conversation, I want to remind you that KPFT Houston is currently in a fund drive. As public radio, KPFT Houston can only exist with your support. Over 90% of our funding comes from listeners like you. If you're enjoying Gulf Streams and want to support our work, please call 713-526-KPFT and pledge a donation. You can make a one-time donation or become a monthly sustainer to support our work. In the coming weeks, Gulf Streams will feature conversations with experts on infrastructure, oil histories, as well as many other exciting topics. Call 713-526-KPFT to learn about all the unique pledge drive offerings going on this month. We're delighted to bring you important conversations about environmental and climate issues here in Houston and beyond on Gulf Streams, and can only do so with your support. So please call 713-526-KPFT, make a one-time or sustainer donation, mention Gulf Streams, and help us keep ad-free public radio on the air. Today I'm joined by Dr. Scot McFarlane, a historian who has written extensively on the history of oil production in Texas and Texas history more broadly. Dr. Scot McFarlane, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, I'm really fascinated by the work that you do and the way that you think about both the history of oil in Texas and the long-lasting implications of these early histories. And, in Texas, oil is so fundamental to how we view ourselves along the Gulf Coast more broadly. And it's a central part of identity and kind of culture. And I'm just really fascinated by you going back to really the beginning of kind of oil history and thinking about many of the things that got established in that period that continue to impact, decades after and even into the present. And one of those things is that I find really interesting is you write on the myth of oil and this kind of broader story that we tell in the South about how the South was industrialized, modernized, and really kind of brought into a modern economy all through oil. And you really argue that this, ignores a lot of the realities of how oil came to be a dominant economic force in the Gulf. And so we're going to talk through that a good bit, but can you just start us off and tell us a little bit, what is this myth of oil that, maybe we sort of know, or maybe we're not super familiar with, but can you tell us what that story is?
I think the myth of oil is that it's just that it's all new, that oil changed everything, and that none of the old power structures were carried forward with it, that anyone could get rich from oil, which also wasn't true, and just that there was sort of a lack of there's not enough willingness to acknowledge the ways in which this carried over old practices, and that way you couldn't figure out what was new and what was old, which made the world sort of, in a sense, more unsafe and more unjust than it could have been if this myth hadn't existed.
Hmm. So, I mean, your research really looks a lot at kind of the Great Depression era, which is interesting because I think for a lot of folks, if they think of kind of oil history, and probably if they're going off of their history class from high school or from junior high, I think a lot of people jump to Spindletop, 1901, birth of Texas oil and setting off the oil boom. And a lot of what you're looking at though is that things really get kind of consolidated in late 1920s, 1930s, then really around this kind of 1930 turning point. Can you just walk us through a little bit? What were the early days of oil in Texas like, from that Spindletop discovery to the period that you're really looking at? What takes that time to really get going in the Depression, and how does the oil industry start evolving at the beginning?
Yeah, well, we go back further. I mean, native people and early European explorers all saw oil in different locations, and perhaps there were some, say, non commercial capitalist uses for that oil. And then the big story of oil in the United States is in Pennsylvania, and then in Texas, the first big oil moment is in Corsicana, which
Hmm.
happens in the 1890s, and that's sort of really the first significant oil field in Texas. But that's I think that oil field I read somewhere had 839,000 barrels of oil
Wow.
over its lifetime, and compare that to Spindletop in 1901, which the Lucas Gusher was putting out 75,000 barrels a day. So you get the Corsicana whole oil field from the single gusher in a little over 10 days. Um, but then you fast forward to the East Texas oil boom in the 1930s. In 1 year, there was almost a, and there was perhaps more because there was regulated and sort of unregulated barrels. There was over 150 million barrels of oil in a single year. Um, so the sort of these scales keep uh, orders of magnitude keep changing, in a period of just over 30 years. Um, and so that's why I go to the East Texas oil boom, because that's the largest oil field in the contiguous United States. That's the big one everywhere, and that's the one that uh, sort of has shaped history more than any others. But Spindletop is exciting, and it was a turning point in the oil and people's willingness to come to Texas to invest time and capital in looking for oil discoveries. And it was also exciting. One of the things that when I started on this research that I don't know, it's kind of, I don't know if it's surprising, but there's a lot of cultural history of oil, and the ways in which there's the myths, the ways in which I don't know, people get excited about oil in these different moments, the terms they use, um, and so one of the main arguments I make is that the only way to understand the history of oil in Texas is to understand its history of agriculture. And you can see that through the terms that people are using to describe it. So oil field, or otherwise oil patch after the cotton patch.
Hmm.
And the term for the sort of the lowest person with the least amount of experience on a rig was a boll weevil. And today, I still have friends who've worked in the oil industry, and the term is worm, which
Hmm.
is sort of, we've gone from boll weevil to worm. Uh, and there's some historians who've done a lot of work on the history of the boll weevil. And what's interesting is that the ways in which that ties into the myth of of oil too, because the boll weevil has its own set of mythology. There's a boll in Enterprise, Alabama. You can go see the boll weevil monument, and the boll weevil itself, it wasn't necessarily the reason why cotton production was declining or why changes were happening in the in cotton farming. But it had so much sort of weight as an idea that people used it to explain a lot of other things that were
Mhm.
happening.
So it became
Um,
kind of a catch-all thing to accuse of the decline of the cotton industry.
yeah, but it's also telling that the people who are coming to work on these rigs, that they're called boll weevils, that they're saying like the people pushed out of cotton farming are the ones that are now working on these rigs.
Well, and that's perfect because, I mean, you had mentioned the importance of the agricultural system to establishing the oil or the early oil system. And so I wonder if you can talk more about that. And I'm curious, what did East Texas, what did these parts of Texas before drilling came in, right? It's not like they didn't have oil, but before drilling became the primary economy, what was the primary economy? What did these places look like? And then how did that start to change?
Well, I think the big thing in a place like where the East Texas oil boom took place is that it was very poor because of a long history of cotton farming that relates to the history of slavery, of sharecropping, of debt, which is very important. How both the poor white farmers and black farmers were sort of tied into these cycles of debt that forced them sometimes to plant more cotton, which then also was hard on the land. And and so these were very poor places before oil happened. But that is also sort of what laid the framework for what followed. If you think about who owned the land,
Mhm.
uh, who who was in debt versus who controlled those debts, and that sort of explains a lot of who benefit. And the other thing that's sort of noteworthy is, can't remember off the top of my head what the percentage, but most people who farmed in the area where the East Texas oil field ended up, they didn't own that land at all. They were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, um, so they were never going to really benefit from that. And then, what's also noteworthy is basically by the time the boom happens, that land was almost worthless. That there was very, very low prices that you can sell them. So when prices for land, when the boom started out, increased tenfold, they were coming up from a very low level. Um, so yeah.
So I mean, in some of this, kind of myth making, I think, I'm sounding a little older at this point, but I think one of the places people would tend to go is Beverly Hillbillies, right? Is this kind of idea of, oh, I have this land and oil pops up and now, I'm super rich. There's multimillionaires. And what you're pointing out is that a lot of these people don't actually own that land. Even if they do, the value of it doesn't really increase that much. And so, I mean, I think that's one of the, as you mentioned at the beginning, this kind of idea of instantaneous wealth. Who is that actually going to? And are the people who are, already living there, are they really benefiting? Or, I mean, one of the things you write about is the mass migration that actually winds up happening as people come to take up these drilling jobs. And so I'm wondering if you can walk us through a little bit some of those different economic forces that are going on at this early history.
hmm Well, a lot of different people got rich from the oil boom, and sometimes they were poor white people, sometimes they were poor black people. But those are the exceptions because I said the majority of people who were farming at all didn't own the land. But even those that did, they still, it was not always possible for them to benefit from it. So I think, I actually haven't seen this movie, but the Killers of the Flower Moon
Oh, yeah.
uh, is tells a version of the story where you may own the mineral rights. You may sort of be entitled in theory to that wealth, but violence and racism play a role in who actually uh, benefits from that. And so this is happening in the context. The Longview race riot was in 1919, and there was also the Slocum massacre that took place.
Can
Those
you
sort of
quickly just
over.
can you just quickly tell us what those are, just for folks who aren't familiar?
Yeah, so there was 1919 was a period in which there was a lot of violence, of sort of racist violence about following World War One, in which people who had served, Black people who had served in the military, were seeking to define their freedom, and in response, there was these. They were called race riots, but in some cases they were essentially massacres. So I think a good example of that, a couple of years later, is it's now known as the Tulsa Massacre, uh, but it was called for a while as the Tulsa Race Riot. And if you think about the Tulsa Massacre, that's happening um, in a place that's also been shaped by an oil boom. So oil is kind of woven woven in here. And the Slocum Massacre took place in Anderson County, and that was in uh, about two decades before the East Texas oil boom. But that was where an undetermined number of Black people were massacred because of jealousies over their ownership of land and their success in that area. And so this racist violence is a part of the story. And what was really striking when I was doing this research is that in some of the interviews of some of the wealthier players in the oil field, they describe how people had mentioned these threats of racist violence, and then that they explained, this is why I could not sign a lease with this Black family, because somebody else had threatened them with violence.
Well,
Um, so it's not like there's no theoretical, or there's no need to sort of jump make any jumps here. It's in the record. People are saying this, and um, admitting to these things. So that's playing a role in how Black people are able to benefit or not benefit from this. But then the other story is also of how this work is done, and who's doing the work. Uh, and so, sort of stepping back for a second, one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is I live in New England now, and here we have this sort of different story of agriculture to industry, where really in the early 1800s, all of the worn out farmland and families that were too big to support, they end up going into the factories of places like Lowell, these big industrial mills. And it's a rather abrupt transition from farming to factory. But agriculture, as something that a large portion of the population is doing, endures a lot longer in the South, for a number of reasons. But by the 1930s, there's still a lot of people who are farming in a place like East Texas. But rather than go directly into the factory, oftentimes they're going to an oil rig that is located, as the original rig was, that started off the East Texas oil boom, in a cotton field. And maybe they're even also working part of the day on the farm to support themselves before these discoveries are made. So a lot of they were called, I think, something like poor boy rigs, where they would use things like cotton gin boilers to actually power the rig. So the
wow.
technology that was used was sort of repurposed from agriculture. And then one thing that in this cultural history that I've alluded for, that you'll see in a lot of different history books and things, is the sense that that these former farm boys, because they were all men, and that's the thing I can return to, had experience working on the farm, where you kind of have to be creative and sort of mix tools together to solve problems, and that sort of hard working ethic, and sort of experience with being sort of ingenious with making do with what you had, is part of what was carried over to the oil industry. But it was also different in that only on the rigs themselves, those jobs were limited to white people. So unlike farms, where Black and white people work together, and often in quite close proximity, even though there were there was Jim Crow, and that there, certain places were more segregated, that there was this world in which, black and white people were working on these farms, and also that men and women were working really side by side, hoeing cotton and harvesting it, and that this changes when you have these oil rigs, which were only open to white men.
Mm.
And you can see that in the census for one of the big counties. I think it's, let me see, I have my notes here. Gregg County, one of the two big counties from the oil boom. Uh, in 1930, the population of Gregg County was mostly black, uh, and by 1940, by the 1940 census, that population makes up less than a quarter of the
Wow.
population. And why is that? And it's interesting, you think about these push and pulls, and you think about the history of the Great Migration, where black people are moving to cities, not just in the north, but they're moving to places like Houston, where it
Mm.
has this growing petrochemical industry, and this push and pull, and who's being pulled into this oil boom, is white people who can work in these jobs, even if certain other jobs were open to black people, such as haulers using mules to haul this big equipment through this infrastructure in this area that was not meant for the kind of industry that developed there. So you have all these stories of these muddy roads of people charging tolls to get by on places where they've improved them. So that's sort of showing you the ways in which this world is changing very dramatically in a short period of time, of who lives in a place, and of who does the jobs, and how those jobs are integrated, both in a sense of race and gender.
Yeah, I'm curious. Can you talk, as I mean, this is something you've written on, but you do demonstrate this has really kind of fascinating impacts, and we've touched on a good bit on various forms of racism that start to emerge, and I think we'll probably return to that as well. But the gender component, I don't think many people would think about that the oil industry comes and that actually daily life looks quite different for women in these places than it had before. So can you walk us through a little bit some of how that changes what lives between men and women, but especially for women, start to look like as husbands go off to rigs?
Yeah, well, I think it's just an example of how, I think, also maybe somehow tying it back to that myth. Um, in the sense, here is something new, where men, women, and children used to all work together on these farms, and now they don't. And in some cases, what the wages from these rigs or potential wealth is enabling people to do is to where only one person is earning wages, which is the man,
Hmm.
and then the woman is doing all the work that is now unpaid and unappreciated, in the sense of working in the household. And that suddenly, there's this much starker division between men and women, uh, in the home and in the workplace, and it's something that didn't exist before, in this setting. So sometimes, you think about people who are trying to argue against, certain policies today or whatever, and you think, well, this history actually shows a place in which men and women both worked, and they worked together, and that it was not segregated by gender.
I want to go back for a second to you were talking about the way that the farmers and their ingenuity, as you were bringing it up, would take that kind of genius mixing of tools and figuring out solutions onto the rigs. And you actually wrote at one point that oil heightened the stakes of improvisation in terms of both potential profit and the costs paid in lost lives. And so one of the things that you kind of highlight is both this culture of going in and the kind of violences that we see of removing people from land or from farms, but also the violence of actually being on the rig because it takes a toll on people. It's dangerous work. what did that work look like? And then also, I mean, how do we think about that as this kind of violent origin of many of these oil companies in this period?
Yeah, I think they're somehow explaining how that life was sort of too cheap in this period, and that the rush to drill more, and the ability to say, well, this is great, these look at these farm boys doing this work, and they're figuring it out and making it happen. It came in at a high cost of people's lives, and there was a number of more noteworthy uh, explosions that happened and injuries, and sort of throughout, not just in the East Texas oil field. You can read about sort of what are the ways in which people were killed or maimed, and the deadliest, so the deadliest school disaster in American history took place in the oil field. And this was a new school that was built, and it was a school only for white children. And what they had done is they had piped in uh, gas from the field, but there was none of the sort of regulations about how that was done, or the fact that you need to uh, make gas stinky so you can smell it if there's a leak. And it exploded, and it's the deadliest disaster in terms of number of lives lost in American history in a school. And when it happened, a lot of people thought it was one of the boilers, maybe one of the boilers that had been a cotton gin boiler exploding, because that wasn't that uncommon for them to explode. And
Wow.
so people thought, oh well, perhaps a few people died, but no one expected disaster um, of that severity, and that many people who died. And part of that is just the sense in which here's this new school that we're building with money, this new school with the wealth of oil and ingenuity, and no one had there was no sort of sense of slowing down and thinking about, well, what are the new risks that are involved with the oil and gas. And and so it came at a great cost, and so only through things such as that disaster, that tragedy, were people able to slow down a little more and think about what regulations needed to be in place to protect people's lives.
Mm. Well, and I think that New London school example as well that you bring up is interesting, just because it's a fascinating story that I encourage listeners to go seek out, because that, I mean, that tragedy is just, it's heartbreaking, but it's also kind of a case study in cost saving measure after cost saving measure of going from a system the architect had wanted that didn't get employed, to tapping into local gas lines that wasn't really sanctioned as a savings measure, and just demonstrates that, certainly it's about new technology and unknown risks, but it's also about, when we do have safety mechanisms in place, they can be more costly, but they exist for a reason. And so, I mean, I find that a fascinating example, not just of, the way that we think of oil companies, but how local places respond to oil companies, and the sudden influence of, now there's available oil and natural gas, now there are these resources, and how other places in these communities, really seek to go for the kind of fastest, cheapest route sometimes, which I think, gets to this broader kind of cultural thing. And is interesting. And I want to turn back to the agriculture a little bit, because I think as we think of Texas moving from a kind of predominantly agricultural state with its set of, kind of rural histories and culture, into much more of this oil-based one, where you do start to see industrialization in cities, of course, but you're still seeing this element of rurality, that starts to really impact how people understand their place and where they live and how we understand Texas. And I want to talk about that a little more, but I also want to talk about some of those other changes you mentioned in that agricultural transition, because something that I don't think we've talked about yet that you write a lot about is that as these oil companies start coming in, the technology that oil drives also starts to directly impact farms, and actually smaller farms start to get closed down and consolidated for a variety of reasons. But can you walk us through a little bit of how those technologies influence each other, and then some of the impacts for the traditional farm economies in these areas?
Yeah, so this is everything is coming to a head in this moment in the 1930s. It's a moment of tremendous change in the South in particular, more so than anywhere else in the United States. And so earlier I mentioned that the the youngest or the greenest hands on a rig were called boll weevils. Well, I argue they should be called tractored out something. I don't have a good shorthand for it, but tractors were what were one of the things that were transforming this period where mechanization and tractors powered by oil are sort of that agriculture is being remade from something that families did on a smaller scale. Um, and it's not once again, sort of thinking about it, it's not a world that we should be nostalgic about.
Mm.
It was full of challenges for Black and white people who were doing this work. Um, but it was one in which there was sometimes certain levels of autonomy and sort of there were bounds on it, whereas tractors was all about was sort of the big agriculture that we know now, that where people were sort of rapidly displaced from these farms in sort of brutal ways, and sometimes they're stories about people being evicted in the middle of winter with nothing. And tractors are sort of this key crux in which larger, more powerful landowners who in the East Texas oil field are gaining wealth from oil, but who otherwise in the 1930s are getting a lot of capital from the federal government
Mm.
uh, through different programs, are using that capital not to support the farmers working the land, but to sort of enrich themselves in the process and using tractors. And Texas and Oklahoma are noteworthy for sort of harnessing a lot more of this capital towards tractors. There's a tremendous amount of tractors coming in to those two states in this period, and so yeah, it's all this is happening is coming to a head at once in this moment where you know the world of southern cotton agriculture as it was, you know, and there's a lot of continuity that you can draw even before the Civil War with how that work is done and who's doing it, uh, is coming to a close, and the changes are happening so abruptly that it's making life that much more difficult for many of the people who are already suffering. Um, and the other story that's sort of taught that carries through here, that's where everything is woven together, is just the story of environmental degradation,
Mm.
and as another way in which, and it is also sort of, you think about this, what makes Texas unique, what makes the South unique, and why do we continue to refer to the South as a region, and the environment is part of the explanation. It's the soils. It's you know why is the largest um, oil field in the contiguous United States in East Texas, and then why was it so hard to be a farmer, at least a smaller farmer in the 1930s in the South? And part of the answer is the particular soils that are more easily eroded, where there's more intense rainfall to erode those soils, and that this is part of the reason why it was hard to farm. In addition to sort of bigger structural forces, especially around credit and debt, and that the land was worn out in many ways, and that this also happened, that oil could reinforce that some places maybe there's a I read a oral history of someone in Corsicana, the sort of the first sort of significant commercial field in Texas, and they describe the ways in which you couldn't grow anything on a lot of the land for a long time because they've just been coated in oil for so long.
Mm.
And then they describe, well, what grew on it first was Bermuda grass, which I don't know. I'm sure someone has written a book on Bermuda grass, but and they sort of describe the ways in which this happened, sort of without a acknowledgement of human agency in bringing this oil to the surface, of spreading Bermuda grass, of sort of these things that just happen. But they actually were a result of decisions that people were making. So this sort of history of degradation, I think you can weave in to both oil and agriculture, and that they're not really separate. That maybe, well, surely, there are things that are different about oil that is perhaps more harmful in some ways, but it's a sort of a same ethic in some ways, that many people weren't able to have any kind of ethic of caring about the land because of the world that they lived in, where they had no choices except to grow more cotton. And as a river historian, this interests me too, because a lot of this erosion, where is it ending up? It's ending up in rivers and sort of changing the ways in which they flood, and making it harder for communities that live along rivers to keep living there, keep growing crops in these very fertile bottomlands. But then the story of oil is also different. So the East Texas oil boom, there was so much oil that the Texas Railroad Commission had to figure out a way to limit it. Otherwise, production was just so much that the oil was essentially worthless.
Mm.
And of course, the Texas Railroad Commission itself was in many ways started out as something for farmers to sort of help them sort of combat railroad monopolies and high prices. But in this case, they're sort of taking what was happening with agriculture, that the federal government is coming up with these programs where farmers are plowing under a certain portion of their crops, whether it's cotton or other crops, so that there's less of it, so that they can gain higher prices. And Texas Railroad Commission was really sort of informed by what was happening on a large scale with agriculture, what they were going to do, but to limit oil production. And there's this one case. What was the name of the creek? I think it was Rabbit Creek
Mm.
in the East Texas oil field. And there was a court case about whether the oil that this party was selling was sort of sanctioned oil. And eventually it was ruled that it wasn't. But where they were getting, they weren't, they claimed they weren't stealing the oil. They weren't, but they weren't drilling from it. It was just flowing down, many barrels of it flowing down the creek. And there was never an issue of that. In fact, in this case, the Texas Railroad Commission was saying, you can't sell this oil because it's not sanctioned. So essentially, just let it keep flowing down the creek into the river. So as an environmental historian, those moments really interest me, because it's informed by this larger context of what's happening in agriculture and things like that, but it's also, everyone's taking for granted that there's many thousands of barrels flowing down these creeks, and also saying, let's just let that keep happening, because we don't want to flood the oil market. Let's just flood the rivers and creeks with oil. So it's a telling example.
No, and I thank you for bringing us back explicitly to the kind of environmental. I mean, certainly as this part of a series on, oil histories and how we got to the oil industry to today, this is explicitly environmental, but we often do neglect the kind of environmental disasters of the past, just because they maybe weren't recognized as such, or thought of in the same ways as we kind of imagine today. And they're a different place. I'm fascinated by this conversation around agriculture and oil and these histories, and a lot of what as you were talking, at one point mentioning, the value of the soil. And I immediately went to the Black Belt, which at one point it kind of run from Texas all the way to the Carolinas, and the geological element of that really is further west of Texas, or further east of Texas rather, is referring to the soil itself, this rich, fertile soil that people are so drawn to. And then as we brought in enslaved people to manage that land and to run that land and turned it into plantations and degraded that soil, but at the same time, culturally, we think of the Black Belt today as meaning this, variety of places that are predominantly Black occupied. And there's also this element, though, of the Black Belt almost referring to oil, and those things map interestingly very closely onto each other. So this history of explicitly, the forced enslavement of peoples, the kind of industrialization of agriculture, the industrialization of oil, that all of these things run together. Even in your work, when we're past slavery, but thinking about the early history of oil, one of the things you write about a lot in the 30s is the fact that the Depression brings so many people to this new oil boom, these new oil boom towns looking for work. And I mean, I think that's really significant in some of the work that you do, is pointing out that, like, sure, there are winners in this scenario, but there's also a lot of losers. There's also a lot of exploitation, right? There's a lot of the reason much of this industry is able to be so remarkably successful in its origin is there's really cheap labor available, and then conditions are hard, and it's a violent industry. And I think reshaping that, has been fascinating for me, but is also really critical to understanding how how this industry originally was coming into power, how it moved through space. But I'm curious, what legacy does that leave for us? How does understanding, now that we've deconstructed this myth we were talking about at the beginning a little bit, how does that help us to understand oil today, and what the place of oil is, and recognizing these factors that drove it? What does that mean for us in thinking about what the oil industry's future should or could look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I wrote about is that all these white boys who became men, who many of whom who had various racist prejudices,
Mm,
they so many people learned to work on an oil rig in East Texas, and
mm,
then right around this same period, we start to move to oil as a global story and
mm,
to places in the Middle East. And so there's some good scholarship out there about the ways in which sort of segregation and racism was exported to places like Mexico and
mm,
Saudi Arabia. But there's also another story there in which these guys became more cosmopolitan and were changed by the world too.
mm,
And so it's not that there's just this through line, this sort of negative through line, but that also that that everyone was changed in this process, even if it wasn't sort of a linear sense of progression. And I've been thinking about this question because I've benefited from the oil industry myself. So my great grandfather was known as the Cotton King of Texas,
oh wow.
and he was this. He didn't own much land. He would have been considered a small or medium sized farmer, but he entered in the 1920s. There was this contest run by the Dallas paper to sort of, in this moment when people are struggling, when cotton agriculture is really struggling, they're trying to figure out how can we produce cotton more efficiently and more effectively in this moment. And my great grandfather, this contest was run for a couple of years. He won the contest twice. He grew, I don't remember exactly the details of the contest, but it was how much cotton you could grow on a certain amount of acreage. So he
Mm,
grew more cotton in a relatively small area than anyone. He what did he do? He rotated, he fertilized, he kind of did everything, and he was able to do that because he had some flexibility. They were also had a dairy operation there. I imagine that was good fertilizer. So this this person who was not one of the mega tractor farmers, but who had enough uh, of an ability to invest in some improvements on the farm. Uh, that farm also disappeared, and the where the family McFarlane farm is now in Palestine, Texas, where I went to elementary school, is now right where the Walmart Supercenter is, and so that's sort of a telling story about global things. But then my grandfather, my great grandfather's son, he went into the oil business,
Mm.
and he had ups and downs, but that his success there is sort of what enabled me to, in part, to sort of get an education that many people growing up in Palestine are not able to access. And so I do think about what that means, and I don't necessarily have a satisfying answer, though it's clear now that I've studied this history that that was not an opportunity for everyone to benefit from, but that I did, and my family did, and so I think on the one hand can be grateful for that, but on the other hand, clearly there's a sense in which we have to think about how we can ensure that everyone has opportunities that weren't open to everyone in the past. So.
Well, and I love that you bring this back at the end directly to personal history as well, and that lovely kind of note of the ways that history so directly shapes us. It's a great place to stop, and we are out of time. So, Dr. Scot McFarlane, thank you so much for talking with us today. This has been a delight and deeply informative. Really appreciate your time.
Great. Yeah, thanks. This was a lot of fun.
Now we'll go to our researcher, Alex Little, with another in her series on DIY pieces, this time thinking about transportation.
Hi everyone, it's Alex. I'm back again with some more DIY climate solutions that you can integrate into your everyday life. Today, I want to focus on transportation. How we get around has a major impact on the environment. Of course, you're probably aware that a major pollutant for our air is car exhaust, for example. In fact, the World Bank says transportation is the fastest growing contributor to carbon emissions. According to Earth.org, transportation is responsible for 23% of global CO2 emissions, 27% of global energy consumption, and 64% of global oil consumption. This doesn't just include your daily commute, though. Even things like traveling can impact the environment as well. Actually, Yale estimates that 8% of global carbon emissions are caused by travel and tourism alone. But the numbers aren't really what's important here. This is all just to say that how we choose to move around makes a difference. However, it's not always feasible to just stop using all modes of transportation, especially if you live in a city like Houston, where traveling by foot isn't always the easiest or safest option. So today, I just want to share a couple ways that we can at least make our commutes a little greener. So what is sustainable transportation? Well, we can start off with sustainable transportation is the conscious act of making fuel-efficient choices while also balancing the demands of our lifestyles. For example, many of us work across town or maybe need to visit family in another city. So it's important that we can accommodate our needs while also limiting our impact on the environment around us. It's all about being rational and having some balance. For example, instead of driving yourself to work, you could consider carpooling, which reduces the total amount of gas you'll need to get to work. Or similarly, opting for public transportation is an even more fuel-efficient choice. And if you're able, choosing to bike or walk to work actually just cuts out the need for an engine altogether. But if driving is your best option, another thing you can think about is maybe eventually moving to an electric vehicle, which can be a really smart investment and way to reduce your long-term emissions. While driving, there's also something called hypermiling, which is the practice of stretching each gallon of gas as long as it can possibly take you. So this can include things like slowing down when you're accelerating or decelerating, as this actually wastes less gas. Other things like letting up on the gas pedal while you go downhill, avoiding idling, and changing lanes less frequently are other methods that hypermilers will use to ration their fuel. We can also be more conscious about the ways we travel. When you go on vacation, consider spending more time in one place rather than bouncing around many cities at once. This can reduce the amount of fuel which we use to get you from place to place, and will also allow you to get more out of each vacation that you go on. If you choose to fly by plane, you can actually look on many airlines' websites for any environmental initiatives, such as carbon offset plans, before you purchase a ticket. However, flying tends to be less fuel efficient than train, so if you have the option, traveling long distance by rail is typically a smarter option. Road trips are also less environmentally taxing than plane rides, especially if you travel in a group. If you're embarking on a road trip, here are a few things that you can keep in mind to reduce your impact. First, pack efficiently. According to Big Bear Engine Company, a 10% reduction in the weight of your luggage can yield an 8% improvement in your fuel economy. So not only is this better for the earth, but also for your wallet. You can also pre-plan your routes on Google Maps to make sure you're taking the most direct routes. You can try installing a fuel-efficient engine in your vehicle if you're handy like that. Using cruise control when you travel on long roads can yield a 15 to 30% improvement in your fuel economy. So not only is it easier for you, but also better for your gas tank. Finally, avoid idling. The Department of Energy suggests that 10 seconds of idling uses more gas than turning your car off and on again. Some cars even have an eco setting where the engine will just turn off automatically when the vehicle stops. And this can be a super nice setting if idling is something that you want to be more conscious about. So there's clearly a lot you can keep in mind when it comes to transportation. But something I've always found is that reducing your emissions is easiest in cities that support sustainable transportation. For example, cities like Seattle and Oakland have what are called slow streets, which protect cyclists and pedestrians from fast drivers and enable safe, environmentally friendly transportation. Additionally, many cities are opting to expand their public transportation routes to serve more high traffic areas of town and reduce citizens' needs to drive. Although these solutions may feel out of your hands, using your voice and vote can be a good place to start asking for change. All in all, making small changes to how you get around can have big results. A great example of this in real life is the impact of COVID lockdowns on our global emissions. So from April to June of 2020, when quarantine restrictions kept people from around the world cooped up in their homes, Boston University estimates that global road and commercial air traffic decreased by a respective 51 and 74%. During this time, global particle number concentrations, which is basically a metric used to quantify the amount of air pollution, also decreased by 48% relative to pre-pandemic levels. So although the COVID lockdown is a very extreme example, I think it really speaks to the impact large-scale changes in our transportation behaviors can have on our emissions and eventually the environment. So I really hope you all learned something today and maybe even took away a couple things you can implement into your everyday life. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.
Finally, for this week, if you'd like to know how you can get involved in town, maybe a trip down to Galveston's what you're looking for. At the Galveston Artists Residency, a brand new exhibit has opened focused entirely around the Ike Dike, the impending mega project that is meant to protect the Houston Ship Channel and Galveston more broadly. The piece is by artist Fred Schmidt-Arnelis and goes into deeply researched thought around the production of the Ike Dike, where it is in process, why it's being built, and has a tremendous amount of informative information and is sure to get you thinking and conversing with others about this project, both from the artistic standpoint and very much from the realities of a major project that may soon be under construction very near us. So if you're interested, look up the Galveston Artists Residency, and it's a great way to have a day down in Galveston. Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about some of the after effects of oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcasts, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Finally, I'd like to remind listeners that KPFT Houston is in our fund drive. To support more programming, please call 713-526-KPFT. Press 1 for donations and mention Gulf Streams when you pledge to help keep our work going. This work is only possible with your generous support, so please Call in to 713-526-KPFT extension 1 and make a pledge to keep us on the air and bringing you the most important stories about the environment and our changing climate here in Houston. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Caroline Paulin, Alex Little, and Jessica Shue. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.